Okay.
I think we're going to get started.
Good morning, Ken.
Good morning.
I'll be right back.
Let's go ahead and get started. We've got Alison Wingfield here today, and Alison has choir, so she's for sure is going to be out of here by 9:40, and I know several of you do too. So thank you for being here on this May day. We're glad for the rain. We're glad for the sun. This is good. We're sorry that Kay is still out. We're hoping she gets better. And, sure. What? Oh yeah. Okay, guys. Everybody, we're standing against that wall.
Whiteboard.
Okay. No, you sure? That's our. We got more room over there. This is whiteboard. For everybody up here.
Chairs right here, and the people can stand behind.
A lot of people. We're missing about half our.
Yeah, we're missing half our class today. But
You are?
yeah.
Are you gonna shoot us or should we today?
Firing squad? Yeah. Okay, bye. No, you're special.
Okay, we're doing it next. Good thinking, Ryan. Yeah, we're missing half a class.
If you didn't read your lesson, you're going to be shot.
So another day we'll do that. I'm going to pass two things around. We don't have any birthdays this weekend here. But I'm going to pass this around because you might see something here that you know is on here. It's the prayer request. So I'm going to pass both of these around, starting with Robert. And we'll go from there. We've got a few announcements before we turn it over to Alison. The senior recognition is coming up, so be aware of that. They urgently need help with the CBF assembly for greeters, etc. It's coming up.
That's seniors in high school, right? Not senior adults?
Oh,
Yeah.
Graduates.
Yeah, we can't recognize
Ken
each
looked
other.
puzzled when Dennis said that.
That's it. Let's see, we've got Holy Land trip coming up October 28th through November 8th. Room in the Inn. There are 3 times for Room in the Inn: June 15th, July 20th, and August 17th. So if our class wants to do this, we need to get on board. We can either provide food, we can either just help set up, we can do anything we want. But let's think about that coming up. There's a new program called Women of Wilshire. Wow, with an exclamation mark on after it. We have one for men. It's called Mo. Not nearly as exciting.
Go out and mow? The grass needs to be mowed.
Vacation Bible School is coming up. There's a whole page on it here. And that's pretty much our announcements, our church-wide announcements. Oh, the shower. There's no book signing today and the shower. So if you don't have plans for lunch, there's both Theo and, and shoot, I can't even think. Yes, thank you. We'll be signing books today downstairs at lunchtime, and then the shower is earlier. Diane, what was our total?
We ended up with $220.
All right. Excellent. That's excellent. Thank you. And that'll be our shower. Thank you.
That's a lot of diapers.
Except for mine,
No, it's just gift cards.
Oh, wonderful. For Jacob from the south.
Yes.
Wonderful. Oh, that's cool.
Did you get to sign the card? Jerry,
Behind the times, Dan, I'm sorry.
Jerry, did you get to sign the card?
Oh, and I forgot to say that this lesson of David and Bathsheba is taught by someone who has an email address of he said, she said.
Exactly. I love it.
I didn't even think about that.
That is perfect.
There you go, and there you go.
Dennis, you're on.
Okay, well, let's just start off. First of all, what do you think of when you hear the 2 names, David and Bathsheba? What pops in your mind?
Problem.
Okay. What else?
All these other things.
Okay.
I read an article in U.S. Today that said David and Bathsheba was the most intriguing story in the Bible. And that makes me think of that.
That's very interesting. Yep. Okay. How has our society characterized Bathsheba in the past, or even today?
A seductress.
Yeah,
Okay.
good work.
Pops in your mind.
So have you heard the view that she was responsible, or at least a co-conspirator in what was done to her?
Yes, but really, if you know the story, good grief.
Exactly. So we're gonna lot of those myths and things that have built up around her. And I mean, it's interesting, even today, we all still think about it in that way, right? We kind of put her on a par with David. Well, if you read the verses very carefully, guess what? That's not really how it happens. So let's do, first of all, let me give you a little bit of a setting. Last week you were, David was killing Goliath, right? Was that last week? Okay. Okay, so lots has happened. A lot has happened since last week. After a long struggle with Saul, David has finally become the king of Israel. He was known for his military prowess and success on the battlefield. He is also described as one who honored his word in his dealings with others. This is the setting. Previously, David had attempted to renew a treaty with the current king of the Ammonites, but that king, the son of a king who had a treaty, right, but that king had refused to honor the treaty his father had negotiated. So the Israelites essentially were at war with the Ammonites. This is where we are. So let's turn to 2 Samuel 11 and read just the very first verse. I'm going to read this one. In 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. Yeah, I was like, okay, is it before King? After Kings? No, it should be before Kings.
You weren't supposed to see that.
I did. I confess, I was flipping through going, oh my gosh, okay, because I use technology instead. Okay. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So what do you notice about these two sentences? What is the narrator telling us?
And David should have gone to war. It's that time of the year,
Yeah?
and I guess he was tired of fighting. In other words,
But even if he was king at that time, did the kings go out? I mean,
That's what the Bible tells us right there. When kings go out to battle.
we protect our leaders now.
Right, we have a
you know,
different
at all
perspective.
costs. Yeah,
Yeah, different perspective.
different time.
Yeah.
I got the impression he normally he directed the tactics from the attack side. That's what I.
But he was at the battlefield.
But he was at the battlefield.
Right, right. In the past, all of this other history, David has been at the forefront. He is known as the battle king, right? He's the warrior. He's the warrior king. But this time, he chooses to stay home. And that's just an interesting setting to start with, right? Okay, so who would like to read verses 2 through 5?
Did he see the woman on the roof before he decided to stay home or after?
Well, let's read verses 2 to 5. Find out, Jim. That's a really good question. That's a good question. Okay.
One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." Is that how far you went?
That's perfect. Thank you. What leaps out to you in these verses?
He took what he
Well,
wanted.
He took what he wanted, yeah. Yeah.
and she couldn't refuse because he was a king.
Exactly.
Yeah, she didn't put up, there's no mention of her resisting.
I'm thinking she was probably
How could she?
petrified. I mean, if she doesn't comply, he's gonna kill her.
There's no mention of what she thought either way. Her opinion didn't matter.
That, yeah, exactly. Very good.
But I think, according to Jewish law, wasn't there a time period where like women weren't supposed to be around other people? Like, was she in an unclean period of time, basically, or, okay?
That's it.
Because I was gonna say, I just noticed that, like, is that a double whammy, like, on top of that? Was there?
It's actually mentioning that the reason she was bathing was the time
okay.
was over and she
Okay.
was cleaning herself so she would
Okay.
not be unclean.
But
But
those,
yes,
those lines basically take your doubt away from whether the child that she was bearing was her husband's or
Exactly.
David's. It couldn't have been her husband's because of that period.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, oh,
So
yeah.
that's, the narrator is informing us, yes, this is indeed David's child. Yeah, good point. That's why that's mentioned. Yeah,
You
exactly.
think that she had been told it was a great honor to sleep with the king?
I wouldn't be
Probably had. I
surprised.
mean, whether she didn't have any choice probably, but it was, if you were brought up to believe that, wasn't it?
But at the same time, she was married.
Yeah.
And adulterers
Yeah. Yeah.
would be stoned. So I
Yeah,
mean,
so-
but yet it's the king.
Either way, she's dead.
Yeah.
Either way, she's dead.
And who would believe her?
Yeah.
You know what, how would she be able, who would she go to? So,
But we don't know what kind of character she had. It doesn't say.
it does not say.
Maybe it's not supposed to be significant. I don't know.
I don't know either, that's a good
She was a
thought.
woman.
It's a good question. Yeah, she was a woman, but
Alison.
we do know her name, yes.
Just had a thought, never had a thought before, especially this one. But just maybe, you know, he decided not to go out to war because he'd been walking on his roof prior to this day.
Interesting. Then somebody else had asked that question. We don't know. We don't know, do we? But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What do we learn about Bathsheba from these verses? You said we don't know much. We know a little bit.
We know she's married, we know who she's married to.
Yes.
She was beautiful.
She was beautiful. Know who her father is, and that she's the wife of Uriah. Yeah.
She was young.
She must have been young.
Yes.
Yeah. We know she was purifying herself after her period. The other interesting thing is, she's the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah. Uriah, and you'll see this in the coming up verses, Uriah the Hittite, he's always called Uriah the Hittite, so he was not even an Israelite, but he was fighting, he was living in Jerusalem, fighting with the Jewish, with the Israelites, they weren't Jews at that point. So also interesting, Eliam, if it's the same Eliam mentioned in another place, I didn't mark that down, was actually a major type of general, or I don't know the right equivalent, in David's army. So he's like one of his right-hand people.
Bathsheba's
Is
father.
it? We don't know for sure if it's the same Eliam, but isn't that interesting if it was? It's like, so, because they specifically say she's the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah. So, who's the subject of most of the action described in these few verses?
David.
Yeah. He rises, he's the action, right? He rises from bed, walks around, sees, sends, and inquires, and then he takes. So, again, the other interesting thing about the rooftop, that's been mentioned several times. And I want to read you, a couple of things. The law required ritual washing at the conclusion of a woman's menstrual period. A woman would be highly unlikely to conduct such a cleansing as a come-on. Because we've always said, well, she knew he was watching her, or I've heard that before, or you've seen, like, the movies portray her as a seductress, right? Well, this would not have been anything. I mean, that's the circumstances, think about, that's no. So the other thing that's interesting,
The public nature of that.
well, that's exactly where I'm going. Thank you, yeah,
What did he
exactly.
say?
What did you say?
The public nature of it, being on the rooftop. So, here we go. Ela Marie Davis, a former missionary in Morocco, makes an observation about rooftops in that culture that probably, we don't know for sure, but probably applied also in David's time, and makes his conduct all the more blameworthy. Rooftops are the women's domain. Isn't this interesting? I know, I think it was fascinating. A safe place where they can be outdoors, do the laundry, bathe, relax with embroidery, and gossip with other women on adjoining rooftops. Men are not allowed to look down on a neighbor's roof.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, isn't that interesting? So, I mean, again, we don't know for sure, but more than likely, this is something that is a tradition that's been passed down for quite some time. No one could look down on ours at any rate. This is the missionary talking. Our house loomed far above any others around us, and our rooftop walls were very high. Missionaries living at Derb Scat got into trouble once, though. Because the rooms were windowless, one group of missionaries decided to build a window high up on the 20-foot wall. Unfortunately, it overlooked someone's roof. Soon neighbors came over to complain, asking the missionaries to close the window. It is boarded up to this day.
Wow.
Isn't that fascinating? That's just, that's a cultural thing that we would not know about.
But we don't build windows on certain, like if homes are close.
Right, we
the
do
windows
try to
don't
respect people's privacy, exactly. But I mean, this is like taboo practice, so there you go. I mean, we have all sorts of interesting.
Well, that
Yeah.
could even
Like if I-
have happened as a result of this.
Zero.
Well, there you go. That's true, Brian. That's interesting. That's interesting.
What'd you say, Brian? Sorry.
Well, I said the custom she just read may have come about because of this story of Bathsheba.
Huh?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never even thought about that. That's a good point.
So he was a stalker and a peeping Tom.
Thank you, Kim. David, a man after his own heart. Olson has switched things around.
That's what I found is consistent in my experiences so far with this Bible, is that the key figures are all flawed.
Yes.
And this one's no different.
Yeah.
He talks about that in his
They're
sermon.
all
Does he
flawed.
really?
Line drawn down and he quotes stuff.
Interesting. Well, one of my sources is a book called Flawed Families of the Bible. So, and it takes, a lot of it is from the woman's perspective. I'll just give you a fair warning where we're going here, but not completely, because we all have the faults. We all have that capacity, right? So, to do the wrong thing. Okay, so, yes, flawed families. Let's go back to the action. I've got a quote. I also used some information from Brueggemann in his interpretation series. He points out that the action is so stark. There's nothing but action. There's no conversation that we know of that's recorded. There's no hint of caring, of affection, of love, only lust. At the end of the encounter, she's only the woman. We kind of lose her name again, right? But the telling verb is in, let's see, your version, I can't remember what your version said. NRSV says he lay with her, but the telling verb, according to Brueggemann, is that it actually says he took her. So
Mine said he slept with her.
yeah, so that's not quite
I
a
think there was too
start.
much sleeping going on.
No, I don't think so either. So lay and sleep are sort of a softer thing than took, right? And actually, the verb means took. So,
It leaves less room for consensus.
yes, it does. Yes, it does. Exactly. And Brueggemann points out that long ago Samuel had warned, remember, when Israel wanted a king, right? They just insisted, we've got to have a king. And Samuel warned them, the kings are takers.
Mhm.
And there you
Oh,
go.
wow.
Yes.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
interesting. We never hear the word rape though in this text.
No, we do
I was
not.
thinking that.
But we do the next week we do, the rape
I-
tomorrow.
Mm.
I think,
That didn't, yeah, I thought about that too. Because then that's my next question, thank you very much. In today's terms, was this adultery or rape?
it was
That
rape.
was right.
Yeah. We just brand her as an adulteress, but she was raped. So,
The part about God telling Samuel about the kings,
yes.
because I'm reading this for the first time, everybody in the room knows that. And so Saul was the people's choice, David was God's choice.
That's
And
right.
so I can't halfway expect it, but I guess I'm starting to get conditioned that I was expecting something a bit more perfect, a bit more pure. And then to have this happen, it's why I said earlier, I'm beginning to think,
And it gets worse.
it does,
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
talking about purity.
Yeah, so, but because it was God's choice. And then you go back to Abraham and keep right on coming up through, that they're all flawed. And
That's
so,
what we're told.
yeah,
And we
that's what
were
we're told, that's
And
right.
that's what, and we
I
were
know that's why we're told, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet
Well,
David
anyway.
was
Because
called a man after
are
God's
any
own
of us
heart.
perfect? I'm sorry, go ahead,
And
Linda.
yet David was called a man after God's
Yeah.
own heart.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Maybe there's a little nuanced difference between David and Saul. Actually, quite a big difference.
The king is not above the law.
Yes.
That's something,
Yes.
we
And,
always had trouble.
well, and exactly, and I mean, and that Samuel foresaw that. You know, he knew. What's the quote? Absolute power
Corrupts,
tends to corrupt,
absolute.
and then yeah,
Power
no, power
corrupts.
corrupt. Yeah, there you go.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So
Say that again, Travis.
Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
and it's actually power tends to corrupt.
Not
Correct.
a good version, but I may not be
It's
the
with
best one.
But absolute power does, yeah, the rest of it is correct, yes, thank you. Okay. We talked about how consent was impossible, given her powerless position, right? So, rape means to have sex against the will without the consent of another, and she did not have the power to consent. And really, when you get down to it. The book has an interesting, I just think this is an interesting quote. Male-dominated cultures like Bathsheba's and our own teach women that they are responsible for men's lust. Women may think and may have been told that their behavior evokes this response in men. Not only must women cope with what is done to them, but then they are blamed for causing harassment or abuse. Well, wow, that just brings us right to current culture.
Exactly what I was
Side
saying.
Woo! So, and this book was written a long time ago, actually. Let me find
You don't find the term Me Too in there?
Yeah, this book actually came out 11 years ago. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So, let's talk about it. The elephant's in the room, let's do it. So, the whole Me Too movement, how does this relate to the story?
Well, I'm thinking, as we were sitting here talking about term semantics, right? Like, all of these cases where people have been basically forced into relations against their will, I haven't heard it called rape, but like,
Yeah.
some of the situations were.
The next story, they do call
Right.
it.
Right.
But I mean, even modern day,
Modern
they're
day.
not calling it that, you know. Granted, probably in some cases it was not exactly that, but probably in some cases it was. But
Intimidation.
they aren't being-
Intimidation.
yeah.
Right. And then there's also just the abuse, whether it led to rape or not.
Right.
There's the whole thing. I mean, how many of you, I'm just thinking, speaking to power, and power in our society is a little bit different, right? We have these iconic figures that we have elevated, right, to where they think they can do no wrong. The whole Bill Cosby thing just kills me. It just kills me. I mean, how many of you were raised to just, I loved Bill Cosby. Loved Bill Cosby. And it's just, it's so much more shocking when you have somebody in that kind of a powerful position who is, you know, and I loved his stance on education and all of these things. Of course, it's all been swept away because the power went to his head and he thought he could get away with it. And did for a long time.
But Alison, doesn't it always say, we're going back to kind of what Ken's saying, we're all flawed, and nobody's either all good or all bad. I mean,
Yes.
maybe there are some in prison, but you know, for the most part, not everyone's all good or all bad.
Right.
On some level, he did some good for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Who probably looked up to him for education or, you know, goals and all of that stuff. I mean, we were entertained by him for many, many years.
Right.
But, you know, I mean, does that mean he's now bad at every single thing he ever did in his life?
No, he's not, but it's tarnished everything he's done.
Right.
For sure.
But
Which-
again, we can't.
But
we look at
I mean,
ourselves when we
that can
mess up
happen
and
to
say,
us.
"Oh,
I'm
so
not
bad."
saying it can't happen to us, male or female, yeah. I mean, it's definitely tarnished, and there's a difference also, to me, between him, Harvey Weinstein, you know, some of these people who have been in positions of power, and David later. Not yet. Not yet. But there is a little bit of a difference there that we can cling to, perhaps.
Well, and the interesting thing here is that according to my version, David dragged other people into it. I mean, he's
Yeah.
first he went on the roof, when he knew it wasn't supposed to be on the roof, he looked at somebody else's roof, but then he sent someone else to find
Yes.
out about her, and
And then
nobody,
he's-
those people couldn't say, Chief, you're not supposed to be looking on, you're not supposed to be on the roof, how'd you see her?
Right, and, yeah,
So
and
they
now
were
we told,
put
and
into
then
a
they bring
position
back
of-
and tell him who she is, and he continues on and brings her
They
to
were
her
forced
house.
into a situation probably where they couldn't say, I'm not gonna go do that.
Oh, that's good, very good point, thank you.
Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we
Yeah.
see.
Thank you, that's exact, I was trying to remember that last night, I was like, what is that quote? Thank you.
One sin begets
Exactly.
another, and it just,
You have
You
to
get
cover it all
entrapped.
up, yeah.
Yeah, and it's about to hit the fan, right, it's coming right now. What else do I want to say? I think we've, okay. The other interesting thing that Brueggemann says is chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. We're talking about, David being a man after God's own heart, et cetera, but it's considered a pivotal turning point in the narrative plot of the books of Samuel. So this is a really key passage. Who was it that was telling me that this is, what did you say again?
One of the most intriguing stories of the Bible.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
So the text is placed at the exact point where the narrative shifts from public triumph to personal pathos. It is the abrupt transition from a life under blessing to a life under curse. It's just a real key turning point. And keep in mind that this is written much later, and it's giving a perspective that, for one of their heroes. Huge hero of the faith for the Israelites. And yet they're telling the story. They're telling us about it for a reason. So, warts and all, here we go.
Later, it's, the perspective of the story is not the wrong done to Bathsheba. She was just a woman, but to her husband, and to the army itself, and the morale of the army.
Right, and that's where we're headed right now, exactly.
So even under their circumstances, that was really bad.
Good, yes.
Considering they didn't think much of women
See, right. Okay, so who wants to read the beginning of the cover-up? Verses 6 through 13.
So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite, and Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked Joab and the people, and asked how Joab and the people fared, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, you have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also and tomorrow, and I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house.
Can you imagine David's frustration? Like, really, dude?
As I read that, he made me think of a Navy SEAL. Because,
Nice.
this guy was
Comparison.
honorable.
Yeah.
And if,
Yeah.
if his comrades in arms are
Out there.
sleeping in a tent or in open country, still in the military combat, he happens to be home. He wants to be back with them. He's not interested in anything else. That's what reminded me of. He's an honorable guy, and I mean, that's the way the Navy SEALs are. I mean, I'm sure there are other
That's a
branches.
good comparison.
And it was exactly the opposite of what David did, right?
Okay.
I mean, his men were out fighting and he was home
Yeah.
fiddling around.
Landry.
To put it mildly.
I'm looking at other people's roofs.
I mean, the irony just drips from these verses, absolutely.
Isn't this an adopted faith for him as a Hittite?
Yes.
It's not his native faith. It's not what he grew up with. He made this selection, and he's honoring the selection he made.
Nice, yeah, exactly, exactly. What other observations do you have for these verses? Any questions? Does anybody know what wash your feet means?
Well, feet in general is.
It's a euphemism
Doesn't
for
mean
sex.
feet.
He's trying to tell, I mean, he literally told him, go have sex with your wife, yeah, go see your wife.
Oh, he wants to cover up the pregnancy.
Yeah,
He's-
right.
I didn't understand the feet
Yeah, I
thing.
didn't
That's,
That's
that's the whole point, that's
Yeah, so he was like, hey, it's not mine. They had DNA testing back
So,
then.
am I
I get that.
So is that a new code word now?
It is in the Old Testament, that's the code you need to let, I mean, read Ruth. Read Ruth. Yeah, yeah.
I thought he was preparing to get a gift or get some money. Okay. I get it.
Yeah, no, the whole reason he had Uriah sent, he's trying to cover it up.
Yeah.
He wants him to go see his wife, and have relations with her so that it seems like the child is not David's. Right? So there again, that cuts out that thing you think that they're in love. Well, that's, I don't think so, because he doesn't want anything to do with her. He wants to cover up what he did. So, and again, just like you pointed out, Navy SEAL, David's plan is undone by a man of honor and principle.
Right.
And of course, the other irony is Uriah sealed his death sentence right there by not doing what David wanted him to do.
Yes.
And so it escalates. Right along with you, how different David, who sleeps with the wife of another man, while that man is risking his life for David in a war that was David's war. Uriah's words indict David. That's from Brueggemann. Also, though, of note, it's not just that, oh, all my friends are off fighting, I can't do this. Intercourse would render him ritually unclean for combat. So he would have had to go through a ritual cleansing too, which means he would have been away from the battlefield even longer. So there's all sorts
Really
of things in
honorable.
play here that I think are very interesting. Are we doing on time? Okay, good. We're doing well. Yay.
Uriah understood the consequences of his action,
Yes.
which David
Did not.
He didn't think through all that.
Yeah.
You know, now that you said that about the cleansing, all that, he
Yeah.
thought about the implications of what it would mean if he went and enjoyed himself a little bit and
Right.
chose not to.
Yeah, he was looking beyond that one thing. Exactly. Very good. Very good. Okay, so, and David even gets him drunk.
Yes.
Right. So that explains that. He keeps going,
That doesn't work.
yeah, it doesn't work. He's like, go down to your house, go down to your house. You know, so, nope.
Don't you get
Oh, so he
this?
brings the inundations, okay.
Yeah.
So did his, I guess his wife didn't know he was.
That's
also
a $64 million question. We don't know what Bathsheba knew. Hopefully she did not know about all this part of it. Hopefully she
She
didn't
probably
even
didn't know he
was
was
there.
home, because he hadn't been there at
He
all.
didn't go.
And she didn't know, so.
Yeah,
They didn't
I-
have like, you know,
We don't know.
telephones. and-
That's it, yeah, exactly. That's a question. She might have known through servants' gossip. She might have
Yeah, people
known.
saw, I mean, he didn't come in
Right, right,
secretly, and so you would think somebody, people would have seen him and would have told her.
right.
But she probably also knew he was on her. And he
He was on
still
business
focused on
after
his.
this.
Yeah.
Well, maybe she didn't really want to see him.
Well,
Yeah.
there's that too, because she was being, I'm sure she felt
Oh,
shame.
yeah.
She, all sorts of stuff. That's a good point. That's a good point.
Okay.
So let's go to the next, the crowning blow with what David does here. And I'll just go ahead and read it real quick for us. Yeah, okay. Are we going through? Yeah, okay, sorry, 27. Chapter 11, starting with verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab. This is the morning after he got Uriah drunk, last-ditch effort, and he knows he's going to send him back to the front. He says, in the letter he wrote, set Uriah, in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die. As Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? I'm not how to say it, sorry. Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning was over, M-O-U-R, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son.
So there was, the sin was magnified by the collateral damage. Because there were a lot of other people that probably wouldn't have been killed had you not instructed them to send Uriah close to the wall. I didn't get the whole bit about the woman dropping the millstone. I don't know, what was that?
That is referring to a previous battle. It points us back to Judges, that they were fighting too close to the wall, and a woman in the city had a big rock and just threw it down and killed somebody. So
She's not seeing women in the battlefield, so it's like I'm not.
She's from the city.
I mean,
So
trying to understand why he mentioned it.
It was kind of derogatory, really, saying, you know, if you're going to get that close, you know, somebody's going to get you. That's just not, that's not good tactics. So Joab, this is Joab saying all this, right? Why did he say all this?
Well, because a battle report was going to come back to David.
Yes.
And that David, as any king would be displeased with bad news, except this isn't bad news because Uriah died.
Exactly.
And that was the code word that would get David off the backs of the messengers and Joab.
Exactly. Job was just following orders, but he's reminding David that he was just following orders.
Well, I think he's reminding David he's responsible for that loss of life.
Nice.
Yes.
Oh, that's good. That's a really good point. I like that.
I'm struck by David's attitude.
Yes.
His attitude, do not let this matter trouble you. For the sword devours now one and another, press your attack on the city and overthrow it.
It's like,
What are you gonna do?
yeah, well, you know, it's
All fair
war.
among
People,
war,
yeah,
yeah.
collateral damage.
Right.
People die. And that's very different from the David who cried over the death of Saul, his mortal enemy. Very different. So, lots
I
of,
like what the note in my Bible says. It says that he grieved deeply for Saul and Abner, his rivals, showed no grief for Uriah, a good man with strong spiritual character. Why? David had become callous to his own sin.
nice. Nice. Exactly. Exactly. Very good. Okay.
Do you suppose when Joab heard about him marrying Bathsheba, he kind of put the pieces together and went, oh,
You would think, yeah, I'm sure. He's obviously a smart man. and a military man, and again, yeah, David brought in more people into this sin, right? Include Joab, is a military person.
Well, and he's disliking about Uriah what he realizes in himself. He couldn't control himself and all that, and Uriah was
Yeah.
doing what he was supposed to do, and so it makes him even madder. You know, he's a good guy on top of all that.
Come on, really? Yeah. So, verses 26 and 27, notice Bathsheba's back to being named the wife of Uriah. And what does she do?
She mourned.
She mourns, yeah, made lamentation. She's grieving. That means she's grieving. Interesting, the book says in the Bible, laments call for God to hear, to see, and to intervene. In response to Bathsheba's lament, the Lord does see. So we go to verse 1, chapter 12. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. In other versions, it's, but the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. And I'd never realized that juxtaposition of her lamentation and God's response. And I don't, God might have already intended to call David out, but this could also be answer to Bathsheba's lamentation. So, let's see. Oh, there was one more.
The story in the first few verses, he can't even see it after he's told. I mean, he's so callous. He said he's so callous, he can't even see. When he gets the little story and goes ape and says, that should have killed him.
Exactly.
Wake up, look in the mirror.
Exactly, and that's exactly where we're going. That's exactly where we're going. That's also, I'm sorry, okay. Trying to get my brain together here. In chapter 11, in verses 3, 4, 6, and 14, David is the one who sent, right? He sent the servants, he goes out, he sent Uriah out, etc. But in chapter 12, verse 1, they turn it, the narrator is brilliant. The Lord sends, right? So the Lord sent Nathan to David.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that cool? I was like, that's not me, that's Brueggemann. I did not see that on my own, believe me. So, let's read. Would somebody be willing to read chapter 12? Let's start 1 through 15. Let's break it up.
But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich, the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock of herds to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing, and because he had no pity.
Keep going.
Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house, your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore, the house where you have,
The sword.
the sword, shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives on the side of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all of Israel before the sun. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan said to David, now the Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house.
Bam. Bam.
So his saving grace was he admitted his sin.
And we'll talk about that, yeah. Let's back up to the beginning. What did you think about Nathan's strategy?
I thought it was great.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, he didn't come in and say, you did this. He came in and gave an example for what David had done.
That seems to be kind of a cultural thing, though. Like, I remember on our trip to Israel, Georgia, David Stern was giving us an example one day and kind of had this role-playing thing about how the scroll and then the teaching laws and then the cultural things all go together. It's like a concentric circle. And even today, how they make decisions, like, you know, if we were trying to say as a family, oh, what does the scripture say about this? Well, they kind of have their own, like if you're making decisions about as a family, what are you gonna, you know, your child wants to go to a party, there's a bunch of drinking, how do you think about the decision? And they have this whole kind of role playing, how they go to scripture, then to the other laws, and then to their common thinking. And it's sort of like that Fiddler on the Roof thing. Oh, what did I do this? What did I do this? And they tell stories about,
Interesting.
like, well, what if this and this happened? And then, you know, so I think it's sort of a.
It's also, it's cultural.
Like
Well, what do you
Jesus
think?
always gave those
Yes.
parables. It's kind of the, I think it's the way they make decisions or point things out.
Or
I
pointing
also
things
think,
out. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No.
David was so woven into his web of deception that, and he lost sight of the truth, I think. And
Oh, absolutely.
so like, even if Nathan had called him out directly on it, he couldn't have seen. Like you said, like he had tunnel vision about what was going on.
Yeah, I would agree. What do you think would have happened if Nathan had started with verse 7? So if he had started with the accusation, I think Nathan would have been killed.
Oh, yeah,
Even as a prophet, I think, or kicked out.
Yeah.
That's my surmise. But back to the stories, why do we relate to stories and parables better than the straight truth? What is there about that?
I think it's always easier to see the faults that I had were in someone else.
Yes.
You know, and to be offended by those and to judge those than to recognize them that I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah, and then, but sometimes, doesn't that help you
Oh,
recognize?
absolutely, right,
Yes.
but I would have never have seen it on my own.
Right, no, absolutely not. It's kind of a kinder, gentler way of going, oh, well, there wasn't in this case, right? I like what Brueggemann says, because we are so prone to self-deception, mostly we do not experience our own situation honestly or directly. Ouch, right? That is why we need our artistic portrayal at a distance to see ourselves up close. And I really like that.
My Bible gives an biography of Nathan, and it says he was God's gift to David. The prophet Nathan
Yes.
was God's gift. And then it goes, down below, it kind of gets in lessons from life, and one of the things, I kind of really looked at this and thought it said, a trustworthy companion is one of God's greatest gifts to us. Someone who we can open up to and talk to honestly about things that you might not talk to everyone else about. I've never had anyone like that.
Well, and to tell us things we might not want to hear.
Exactly. And I've never had that close companion.
Right, somebody who tells the truth.
Right.
That is a gift, if we're willing to accept it, right?
Yeah.
That is a gift. All right, what's going on over here?
I'm just telling that's what I did for you.
You're lucky, Travis.
Yeah, right.
You're his spiritual guide.
Oh, man.
Actually, that is
Well, I mean,
Yes.
do y'all have any other examples, I mean, from your own lives, maybe where a book, a movie, a play, or even a piece of art helped you see yourself in a different way? Or maybe a situation in a different way?
I use a mirror myself.
And how does that help you, Jim? Sometimes that makes you think, doesn't it? Yes.
So when I worked at the orphanage in China, there was this kid there who had no ears. And all he wanted to do was lie on the floor and chew a wooden puzzle piece. I mean, he would not, and there was physically no reason he couldn't like sit up on his own. But if you tried to make him, and I'm sure it was a constellation of like that orphanage environment where you don't attach and bond and that sort of thing.
Right.
But basically, if you did anything to him except feed him, he would scream and cry, like just whine. And of course, the caregivers there didn't want to make the kids cry because they would get in trouble, right? But I was like, there is no reason this child cannot do something for himself. And so it was basically the game of, we're going to be more hard-headed than he is. So because he liked to eat, I ended up having volunteers coming in and like helping him feed himself. And little by little, he was eventually able to learn to feed himself. But it was a beautiful spiritual lesson to me because I thought about how many times I whine to God about things when he puts me in situations that I'm not happy about and I don't like him. And yet he knows what is best and what I can do and what he has given me to use, right? And so, and he persists and is more stubborn sometimes than I am until I figure that out and like, oh yeah, this is possible. But it was that tough love kind of idea that more of it was like, how long does God listen to me whine and goes just shut up and do it?
Well, he couldn't hear himself speaking, so.
No, I know, that was it. I decided that's why I did it. And I have a picture of him in my living room, and it just, when I see it, it always reminds me of that life lesson, like, yeah, God loves you that much, and sometimes it makes you do things you don't like, but,
Yeah, it's a good reminder, very good.
He was patience.
What, real quickly, we've got a couple minutes. What do you think about David's reaction in verse 13? I've sinned against the Lord.
He couldn't deny.
Yeah.
He couldn't deny that wasn't him.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was kind of quick about it, though. It really, like, it's
At least
amazing
according
how
to
he
this,
realized it.
Well, after that story, after his reaction was, boom, this man should be killed, etc. I'm the justice, I'm the king, right? He takes that stance, and then it's like, oh, but you're the person. Oh.
He says, I've sinned against the Lord. He doesn't mention Bathsheba,
Thank
Uriah,
you.
the army,
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah.
It says in the Psalms.
Yeah.
Yeah, he does, exactly. So, he's referring to Psalm 51, which is attributed to David after he's been confronted by Nathan about Bathsheba. It specifically says that at the top of the psalm. But at the beginning of it, he says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions." But later he said, "Against you and you only have I sinned." And I've always had a problem with that.
I have too.
I always have had a
Uriah
problem.
and a bunch of his comrades would have a problem with
Yeah,
Bathsheba and
I
the
agree.
others.
I agree. I do have a problem with it, but it's interesting. The book, which, like I said, takes a lot of the perspective of the females in the Bible, but the book says, the author notes that his sin against them, as in Bathsheba, the soldiers, Uriah, was his sin against God.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? So I mean, what do you guys think about that? How does that mess with your brain?
Well, thou shalt not kill.
Yes.
That's a sin
That's
against
shot,
God.
not commit
Yes.
adultery.
Commit adultery,
Yeah.
you know, so that was.
Well, and it might have been easier actually for him to say, oh, I sinned against this person. I didn't do anything to you, God, I did it against them.
Yeah,
So
it's-
really, that's kind of covering everybody. I sinned against God, that means everything down, all these.
Right, and if you think, you're pointing out the Ten Commandments, the majority of the Ten Commandments are about relationship with other people, not about a relationship with God. So I think, yeah, so I think we can get there, even though it bothers me. I think we can get there, to realize that, and in some ways, that's more damning, isn't it?
Right.
For all of us. It's like when we are out of fellowship, when we have sinned or hurt somebody else, that involves God. And that's kind of, whoa, okay. So, yeah, we can't just pick on David, can we?
When I think too, that's what led to his repentance, right? Had he not recognized it as a sin against God, he could have blown it off like what he said.
Nice, yes, yes. So I think that's where the turning point is, and the difference, even today, with some of these figures, is that David finally admitted his fault. Perhaps. I don't know if y'all are in agreement with that, but that seems to me to be some of the difference of why this figure is so revered and studied and of interest in the Hebrew history, but in also ours, because, and maybe perhaps, let me reverse that because I'm gonna finish. But the other interesting thing that I want to point out and still remember about Bathsheba is, hear me now, she was a survivor, not an adulteress, and not somebody to be blamed. But also the interesting thing is, she is listed in the genealogy of Jesus. But guess how she's listed? Yeah, the wife of Uriah. So David's sin was still recognized all the way into the New Testament in the genealogy. David's mentioned also, but Bathsheba is mentioned as the wife of Uriah, perhaps to remind us that, we are all flawed and God still uses us. So,
Alison, that
yes.
this first time I really enjoyed to study the Old Testament. And the Old Testament is a story, the history for the Jewish people. I can see the history is kind of messy,
That's an understatement, right? Yes, it is.
But yet, it's also a story about God.
Yes.
Play a very important part from the Genesis to end the chapter, to the New Testament. How God always loved the people, continue to make a correction, make a detour on their life to make it work for the society, for the good for the people. And you can see that Old Testament is story of Jewish people, but it's also a story, a continuation of a God in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament.
Absolutely, it's our story, isn't it? Absolutely, it's still that continuous arc. So I'll let you get to your prayer request. Thank you. That was a lovely ending.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Name's actually here.
Oh yeah, I know. Half the time I don't do this. I won't forget it.
Okay, let's go through our prayer requests here. Traveling mercies for Barbara Townsend and Barbara Peterson on her Korean trip. So that's
Dennis, that's really important. She is going over there for some big commemoration of the uprising when she and Arnold were over there as Korean missionaries. And she's going to be honored, and she's going to be written up in newspapers, and she's going to be giving a speech. And there's also a cash prize that she may be bringing back to the States in Arnold's memory.
There's some people who are not in favor of the person they housed as well, too.
Exactly, and so she will be leaving next Sunday at 11 o'clock, so if we could keep her in our prayer.
Please pray for my parents as they move this week. So Diana, the house closed.
Closed. Money's in the bank?
Yeah.
They're on the road.
And we need to pray for Diana.
Wednesday?
Yes.
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 My first, Mother's Day, my mom won't be here. First Mother's Day in a long time.
And then another prayer request is for Carolyn Strickland. I texted with her yesterday, she's home.
Oh, she's home, good.
They were able to treat everything. I talked to her earlier in the week, or twice, a couple times in the week, but in fact, Carrie McDougal was able to go see her.
Oh, good.